Hey everyone, Two Angry Frogs here, and as we get ready for the War Within, one of the most difficult decisions, like with any new expansion, is determining what class you are going to play. And especially as a newer returning player, it can be daunting when trying to figure out what is going to click and be enjoyable to you. With 13 classes comprising 39 different specializations, there are a lot of choices. So our goal today is to give you all the information you need and break down the classes and specializations in a way that you can make your decision with confidence. But before we begin, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you always know what we're up to next. Now, let's get into it. Before we dive into sorting out the classes and specs, let's start by saying one of the best ways to figure out what roles and classes do not appeal to you is by playing them. For some, you will know almost immediately. There will be something about the rotation, ability cast times, mobility, and so on that just does not draw you. For example, Demon Hunter was a no-go by level 20 for me. I did not like all the back and forth movement playstyle and just did not find it fun. For others, you will typically encounter something that you just don't grasp, or maybe you find the playstyle boring. In my case, healing just does not click, and especially proactive healing like Discipline Priest. I'm a terrible healer, and it is definitely not the role you want me in. Having said all that, to fully understand the rotation and playstyle for any character, you typically need to play that character at max level. Many of our key class and specialization abilities are in the final selected nodes of our talent trees, which we do not start unlocking until we get near max level. If you ask the question of what class should I play, the majority of the time you'll get answers to play this class because of X or that class because of Y. In contrast to asking what I should play, my approach has been to determine it based on what is left after I eliminate what I know I don't enjoy. By approaching it this way, instead of making a decision among the combination of 39 classes and specs, you decrease it to maybe 10 or 12 to decide from. So let's go through how to get it down to a reasonable number to choose from using my past experience as an example. Determining what roles don't appeal to you is the first step. And here we have tank, healer, and DPS. You can choose to fulfill one of these roles exclusively or play multiple roles. Some players like to stick with one, while others can perform comfortably in all three. We have two different types of classes when it comes to the roles they fulfill. First is the single role or pure class, such as Hunter or Mage, and these only have DPS specializations. Second are the hybrid classes, which can fulfill 2 or 3 roles. For example, Druids and Paladins can fulfill tank, healer, and DPS roles, while Warriors can fulfill both tank and DPS. Some players will find they prefer hybrid classes specifically for this reason. If you get tired of DPS, it is simply a switch of specs to fulfill the tank or healer role. So as a tank, you must be comfortable with leading a group. You're typically expected to lead in dungeons and often in raids, know what route to take, and know enemy and boss mechanics through and through. You must understand how to use your abilities to keep threat and how to use your mitigation and defensive abilities to prevent being one-shot by boss mechanics, also known as tank busters. Playing a tank is a big responsibility, and if you die, it almost always means a wipe for the group. Tanks make up the smallest percentage of WoW players. For healers, over the past few expansions, the responsibility of this role has expanded considerably. Gone are the days of simply keeping the group alive. Now it is to heal the group, handle debuffs, take care of this or that mythic plus affix, and while you're at it, can you do some damage? Like tanks, you must know the primary enemy and boss abilities so you are prepared to heal the tank when they take the heaviest damage. Your abilities range from small heal fast cast, large heal slow cast, and heal over time spells. And knowing when to use the right type of ability is critical to being a good healer. In all honesty, healers are rarely thanked for their efforts and are typically the first, along with the tank, to be blamed when a group wipes. And they are the least common role among WoW players right after tanks. DPS, as the name implies, is about damage. However, it is not exclusive to that. A good DPS player will know when and what enemies to interrupt, when to use crowd control, when to use self-heal and defensive abilities to help the healer, and what abilities can be used to reduce threat if an enemy sticks to them. When it comes to damage, knowing your rotation is crucial, as your job is to ensure you do enough damage to enemies and bosses to defeat them before group wiping abilities such as enrage mechanics. As a DPS, you do have less responsibility than the tank and healer, so it can be less stressful. So with that, take a look at the roles and determine what does not appeal to you. Do not like leading groups? Eliminate all tank specializations. Do not care for being the one responsible for the group staying alive? Eliminate all healing specializations. For me, this immediately eliminated 7 specs, since I do not really grasp, nor do I particularly enjoy the healer role and playstyle. So now I'm down from 39 specs to 32. In addition to the 3 roles, healer and DPS characters are considered either melee or ranged. Even though most specializations have a slight combination of the two, such as Ret Paladin or Mistweaver Monk, we will classify them according to whether the majority of their abilities are melee or ranged. Both melee and ranged have their own styles of play. As a melee, you're on top of enemies and bosses and generally will try to position yourself away from the tank. Many enemies and bosses have cleave and other type abilities that require you to be on the side or behind the enemy. And being behind enemies also reduces the enemy chance of dodging and parrying your attacks. Ranged characters, as the name implies, prefer to fight enemies at a distance. They have a variety of abilities to keep enemies away, such as the Mage's Frost Nova and Druid's Entangling Roots. For healers, melee or ranged refers to the distance at which you cast your healing spells. For example, Holy Paladin is considered melee versus Holy Priest, which is considered ranged. So take a look at melee versus ranged. Is there one you do not like or one that you greatly prefer over the other? In my case, when it comes to solo and open world content, I like playing both. But in group content such as Mythic Plus and Raiding, I found that I am more comfortable in a ranged specialization. I prefer ranged over melee as I find I have more difficulty targeting enemies in melee when raiding or running dungeons. So eliminating melee DPS removes another 13 specs, taking me from 32 now down to 19. In addition to melee or ranged playstyle, DPS and healers have differing damage and healing profiles. Characters generally excel at some, but not all of them. These include single target specs, which tend to have a flatter damage profile, and damage is steady over most of the fight. They may have small windows of burst damage for AoE, but do not excel in AoE encounters. And this would include specs like Frost Mage and Beast Mastery Hunter. At the opposite spectrum of this, you have burst damage specializations. These tend to ramp up into burst damage windows and then ramp down. And damage in between the burst windows is low and steady. This type of specialization includes something like Fire Mage. AoE specializations excel at damaging or healing multiple targets at once, but typically tend to drop off in single target situations as well. Cleave specializations excel when damaging or healing 2 to 3 targets at once. This includes a spec like Destruction Warlock, which has the spell Havoc, which is great for cleaving 2 enemies. Damage over time or dot specializations do damage to 1 or more enemies over a period of time and require managing and refreshing dots on enemies to keep damage going. An example of a dot spec would be Affliction Warlock. And then we have Heal over time or hot specializations, which do healing to 1 or more targets over a period of time and require managing and refreshing hots on players to keep healing going. So to really understand each damage or healing profile requires playing characters that excel in 1 or more and fall off on others. You may find that the type of damage a character does is not interesting or fun for you. In my case, the only playstyle that I don't enjoy are with specs that require a lot of dot management. Again, I will play these when I'm doing solo and open world content, but it's not something I enjoy in Mythic Plus and Raid. So that eliminates the 3 heaviest dot specs of Shadow Priest, Affliction Warlock, and Balance Druid, and now I am down to 16 choices. Another thing to consider is how fast the playstyle is. Some specs have a more consistent flow while others require a bit more button mashing. This is where APM comes in. APM, or actions per minute, refers to the number of keybinds or mouse clicks a spec requires per minute while maintaining their rotation. We'll approach this in general terms as it will depend on the fight and the enemy mechanics, whether the encounter is single target or AoE, and so on. The folks over at simulation.org have run a massive simulation for the most recent raid, Yggdrasil. One thing the simulation shows is the specs from highest to lowest in terms of APM and the numerical value for each. So for example, Outlaw Rogue has the third highest APM at 85 actions per minute. Note that a spec having a higher APM does not necessarily mean that it is more difficult to play, because again, what is difficult for one player to grasp can be easy for another. But with lower APM, there does tend to be more downtime in between casting. Another thing to consider with APM is that high APM specs can be physically demanding. If you have joint pain or have suffered from carpal tunnel or something similar in the past, high APM specs can aggravate these type of conditions. For example, I love playing Outlaw Rogue and I find the style to be very fun, but the toll on my wrist is just too much after a while. So it's not something I can play a lot or for long periods of time. Another thing to consider is the type of content that you plan on doing. If you stick to solo play and open world content, and that is the way you prefer to play, then honestly your class and spec choice really doesn't matter. Find the specs you don't like playing, try out the others, and then pick whatever ones you enjoy. If you run dungeons in low-level Mythic Plus, for the most part, your choice of class and spec can be the same as solo play and open world content. Only when you start diving into higher-level Mythic Plus keys will it matter a little more. Higher levels tend to be a bit more meta-driven than lower-level keys, and you may need to play a specific class and spec to find groups and to be able to fully counterplay enemy and boss mechanics. Rating is where it gets a little firmer. And this really depends on the level of rating. For LFR normal, you should be able to play what you like. For heroic and initial mythic bosses, most of the time it's the same. Where it may differ is when the raid team needs something for a specific boss mechanic. For example, Dathea in Vault of the Incarnates is orders of magnitude easier when you have a Death Knight with Abomination Limb, and you have some specs with AoE, Interrupt, or Stun abilities for the platforms. Depending on the boss, raid teams may also need a certain number of melee and range players or characters with high execute damage, which can drive the need for particular specs. Also note that you may enjoy playing different classes and specs in different types of content. As I mentioned earlier, for myself, I prefer playing a ranged DPS for raiding, and this is true for high-level Mythic Plus keys as well. For dungeons and lower-level Mythic Plus keys, I also like to tank in addition to DPS. And for solo and open world content, I may choose from 11 different specs I like to play, depending on what I feel like doing that day. Many players have multiple characters and switch between them due to enjoying the play style of multiple classes. The final thing I will consider is the spec's utility, mobility, and survivability. Each spec has its strengths and weaknesses when it comes to this combination of attributes. For example, Destruction Warlock has a ton of utility and is very tanky, but mobility is near the bottom. Whereas Beast Mastery and Marksmanship Hunters have amazing mobility, but lack the utility of other specs and have had survivability issues. There are a few things you can look for when it comes to these attributes. First, generally a class with a lot of useful utility will have more responsibility in dungeon and raid environments. Specs with very high survivability, such as Protection Paladin or Protection Warrior, will survive forever, but typically kill enemies a lot slower, so they're not necessarily great for speeding through solo content. And although not as much as we used to see, specs with higher damage may have less survivability. If you played back in the vanilla WoW days, you know why mages were called glass cannons. Utility, mobility, and survivability all contribute to the playstyle of the spec. So as with the others we have talked about, eliminate those that you find uninteresting or you just do not find fun. So I was down to 16 specs to choose from. I know I will be rating every tier, so when choosing a main, that eliminates all tank specs. And I have not played a Drakthir at level 70, so that is a class that I'm not sure whether I would enjoy or not. Probably a good thing to check out before the expansion. So that leaves the following class and spec combinations. With these at the start of each expansion, and sometimes each new season, I generally decide to main Hunter, Mage, or Warlock. For the War Within, after 3 years of a Hunter main, I need a change and I'm heading back to Warlock. As for alts, I will play a lot of them throughout the expansion, whether for open world content, low level dungeons and LFR raids, profession leveling, or just for something different. Choosing a main character can be stressful. We want to know we're making the quote-unquote right choice. But in reality, there are 13 classes and 39 specs to choose from because all players do not have the same likes and dislikes. Whereas you may love the playstyle of Demon Hunter, I knew it was not for me after 10 levels. Every class and spec will have times of low performance and high performance, and the nerf bat comes for every class at some point. But if you really enjoy the playstyle, identity, or aesthetic of a given class, you'll find that you stick with it regardless. So let us know what you think down below in the comments and how you approach your class selection. And everyone, have a great day.